My name is Jonathan Nevill and I'm talking to you from Australia. Today I'm going to talk about dishonesty and incompetence in Australian fishery management. Now, the work I did started some time ago and finished in the publication of a book in 2010. So we're talking about information research which I did now 15 years old, and we'll come to the relevance later at the end of the video. Now, to understand how fishery management takes place within a framework, at the top of that framework are international agreements. For instance, agreements on fisheries, agreements on international trade, agreements on threatened species, international agreements also on the conservation of biological diversity. Now, these international agreements are put together under a framework controlled by the United Nations, and nations like Australia can sign up to them. And Australia is pretty good at signing up to a lot of United Nations conventions. However, the conventions have no penalty clauses. And in fact, the operation of those international agreements is monitored through the production of reports by the countries themselves. Okay, so Australia signs up to an international fishery agreement and then submits reports back to the United Nations on whether or not Australia has been doing a good job. Okay, now this is like putting the fox in charge of the hen house. Okay, so underneath the international agreements, we have management by federal and state fisheries agencies. Now, Australia has 8 provinces, if you want to call them that, states and territories, and each of those, except Canberra, which doesn't have a sea border, has its own fishery agency. Above that, if you like, is AFMA, the Australian Fishery Management Authority, and they set guidelines for the states, but they also manage their own fisheries in Commonwealth waters, that is federal waters. Now, another thing to understand is that when those agencies report to government, ultimately report through to the United Nations, it's the same thing. It's the fox in charge of the hen house. So they do their own reports. Now, another very important link which you need to understand is that scientific funding of fishery management is done by fishery science agencies, and that can be contracted out, for example, to the CSIRO, that stands for Commonwealth and Scientific CSI, Commonwealth and Scientific Industrial Research Organisation, CSIRO. Now, there is a link between the funding for science projects related to fishery management and the fishing industry. Now, that's fair enough, because if you're going to spend money on fisheries science, you want it to be relevant to the fishery industry. So that is important. But if the link is too strong, if there is a veto or effective veto on the part of industry, in other words, I'm saying if industry doesn't like a proposal for a scientific piece of research, or in fact if the scientists have already done the piece of research and the industry doesn't like it, they're quite powerful, because the scientists at universities, for instance, CSIRO, depend for their work substantially on funding, which in part comes from industry. So if a scientist upsets industry, they can be kind of black banned. There's no actual blacklist, not in a physical blacklist, but in practice there is. And one of my friends used to work for the South Australian State Fishery Management Agency. He wrote a paper on bycatch in the prawn trawling industry in South Australia. The industry, the paper was very well done, scientifically sound. Industry didn't like the conclusions, and they refused to work with him. In other words, his boss had to tell him, look, I'm sorry, in any future industry-funded projects, you are not going to be on the team. So there is a pretty powerful link there, and that makes scientists scared. It depends a bit on the backbone of the person in charge. If that person is morally strong and in a senior position, perhaps they can weather some of the criticism from the industry, but a lot can't. And so, if you like, scientists exist in a condition of fear that their results may upset industry. Okay. Now, my work was independently funded by the University of Tasmania, so certainly at the time I had no problems with industry and the way my results would be received by industry. Now, I'm going to quote a section of my report, and this report related to Australia's orange roughy trawl fishery. And I say here, this chapter looks at the orange roughy fishery as it represents a classic example of overfishing under regulation. And that's what my work was about. Overfishing which occurs under regulation. State, federal regulation, if you like. The behaviour of key stakeholders is a critical factor. Amongst the key players in the orange roughy industry were greedy, short-sighted and dishonest fishermen, weak and overly optimistic fishery managers, fishery scientists willing to use improbable and unsubstantiated arguments to oppose the creation of marine reserves over orange roughy fishing grounds. A government environment who approved an orange roughy recovery plan, threatened species recovery plan, which ignored the link between the species and its habitat. And finally, a fisheries management agency who submitted false and misleading information to a Commonwealth accreditation review. Now, later on, if you go to my website, you'll see all of this stuff that I'm talking about, but in a lot of detail. Now, my work did not receive compliments from fishery management agencies in Australia. It received criticism from Australian fishery management agencies, and more than that, which I'll go into. But when my work was published, it did receive compliments from some of the bigger players in the fishing industry, and in fact one or two of the smaller players. For example, a rock lobster fisherman in West Australia wrote to me and said, "Your review of the West Australian rock lobster fishery is the best review I've ever seen." So I certainly got some compliments, but not from fishery management agencies. Now, the conclusion of my work, and I'm going to read this out because it's important, it's short but important. This book explores the idea that poor fisheries management and the economic and ecological damage which follow are largely the result of management failures to implement important strategies to account for uncertainty. Okay, critical word, uncertainty. The two most important of these strategies are the precautionary principle and the ecosystem approach. After investigating the implementation of these strategies in Australian fishery case studies, Dr. Nevill concludes that implementation is at best incompetent and at worst dishonest, verging on corrupt. The study finds strong rhetoric amongst Australian fishery agencies supporting application of the precautionary and ecosystem approaches. However, in the case studies examined by Dr. Nevill's work, that's my work, there is little evidence for enthusiasm on the part of the managers for actually applying the approaches in a thoughtful or comprehensive way. Examples are discussed showing that agencies have published false and misleading information, apparently to create an impression that these approaches are being effectively implemented. I speculate as to the reasons behind this behaviour, suggesting that the explanation lies in cultures within fishery agencies which condone, even encourage, incompetence and foster dishonest reporting. The central conclusion of the book is that steps must be taken to bring about radical change in the cultures which operate within fishery agencies. This could be achieved, I argue, by replacing fishery management agencies with agencies charged with managing marine biodiversity assets. So I'm recommending a huge change, and I'm not the only scientist. Sylvia Earle, for example, a well-known American scientist, has recommended the same thing, that fishery managements should be basically done away with. They should die, and we should replace them with asset management agencies whose principal job is not the production of a product every year or every month, whatever. It's the protection of important assets. Okay, so that work was done 15 years ago. So the question is, what's it like today? What's happening today? In those 15 years, many of the senior managers who existed will have grown old and retired, and new, younger managers will have come up in their place. Has anything changed? Now, unfortunately, no. My work is just as relevant now as it was 15 years ago. I recently got a message from a senior fishery scientist, partly independent, and this message concerns attempts pushed by the by the fisheries industry, but amplified by the CSIRO, Australia's premier government research organisation. So we're talking about attempts by the industry and by government to suppress the publication of a paper, scientific paper, peer-reviewed, dealing with both ecologically good impacts, ecological successes, but also widespread ecological failures. The industry didn't like it and they attempted to suppress it. Now, the message. AFMA made extraordinary efforts to protect its reputation, and the CSIRO made extraordinary efforts to protect their commercial relationship with AFMA. The strength of these protests was stunning. We discovered a lot of information hidden from the public view which suggest various types of collusion between agencies funding fishery research and the fishing industry itself. And this goes back to the point that we started with when this video opened about the link between the fishing industry itself. They've got some power, some control. In fact, it's not just some, it's very, very important, very powerful. They have these controls over the scientific bodies and thus the scientists. Now, a message like this makes me very sceptical of Australia's claims about co-management, right? Co-management, government, industry, management, you know. We're all good guys. We all want the same thing. You know, we all want nice ecological fisheries. We want a bit of profit. We want safety at sea and all that sort of stuff. You know, we're great because we walk arm in arm. The industry walks arm in arm with government, right? Well, this sort of thing makes me very sceptical about that. It looks to me a lot more like regulatory capture. In other words, the industry has captured the regulators. Okay, now I want to talk about a couple of things that happened to me, experiences that I had when I was doing that work 15 years ago. Now, I found that a senior scientist based partially at the university here, University of Tasmania, had published false and misleading information designed to paint the fishing industry in a good ecological light. Now, I wasn't happy that a senior scientist could do something like this without anyone saying anything. So I wrote a small critique of his work, which I published, and you can see it on my website. Now, no senior scientist likes to be accused of publishing false and misleading, deliberately publishing false and misleading information. So I knew I couldn't publish my critique without talking to him. I phoned him, he didn't reply. I emailed him, I said, look, here's a copy of the draft, it's critical of your work, do you want to meet face to face? And he replied saying, John, I can't see the point. Okay. Now, another fishery scientist, somewhat less senior than the one we're just talking about, but also working for the University of Tasmania, as well, of course, as getting external grants partially funded by the industry. Now, a friend of his, who was also a friend of mine, sent me a draft of a paper that this guy had written. And in this paper, he made a personal attack on me using false and defamatory information. And I didn't like that, so I approached the Vice-Chancellor of the university, and the Vice-Chancellor approached the scientist. Now, I was privy to all of this because the conversation was passed between the three of us. Now, the Vice-Chancellor said, "What's going on? This doesn't seem right." And the scientist said, "Look, I don't have to answer to the university. I wrote this paper in my own time as a private individual." Now, the Vice-Chancellor wrote back and said, "I'm sorry, you can't do that. If you are employed by the university, you have to apply the highest standards in anything you publish." The scientists immediately withdrew the draft and it was never published. But that's an example of how low a scientist will stoop if they think they're going to get away with it. Now, during the course of my work, I had a lot of interactions with AFMA, Australian Fishery Management Authority. Now, one of them was that AFMA barred me from access to certain private industry government documents about fishery failures. They simply did not allow me access to those documents. I also asked to attend co-management meetings where industry and the scientists met to discuss programs ahead. I was barred. When I asked for an explanation, they said, "John, your presence at these meetings will not be conducive to the free flow of information." And that was all they would ever say. Now, at a different time, one of the fishery managers from AFMA actually tried to stop my work. Now, I have no idea what was in her head when she did this, but she made it, instead of approaching me, she had read a draft of one of the chapters. It was a chapter on the northern prawn trawl fishery. She went straight to my supervisor and said, "This chapter is riddled with logical and factual errors. This person should not be funded by the university. He is not fit to undertake PhD studies. I suggest you get him out of the program as soon as you can." Now that's a pretty heavy thing to do. It's very unusual for a government fishery scientist to want to remove somebody from a scientific organisation. Now, my supervisor and I responded in the same way. I said basically, "Look, I'm so pleased you've read the draft chapter carefully. I'm so pleased you found errors. Please let me know what they are." Now, I waited and waited and waited. I kept reminding them, "Could you please send me your review?" After 2 or 3 months, I finally got a reply from this girl, this woman, and she said, "Sorry, I'm too busy to comment." Now, in my view, that made a complete fool of her and her organisation. You simply can't make a huge claim about incompetence without offering one shred of evidence. If she was stressed for time, the least she could have done was pick out one or two of the most serious errors and send a message to me and my supervisor. I was left concluding she could not find one single error. That paper was subsequently reviewed by two other fishery scientists, and then ultimately when the book was reviewed by two other fishery scientists, of those four, none could find anything wrong with that chapter. You can draw your own conclusions about the integrity of AFMA staff from that story. Now, I'll end up by making a comment on a scientist who really is, in my view, a bit of a hero. A very quiet scientist. He's been in the industry for a long time, Professor Graham Edgar. Now, he's received various awards for his work. He is a top-class scientist. Of course, some of the, if you publish lots and lots of papers based on very complex data sets, there will be a mistake here and there. And when a mistake in his work has come up, he's remedied it immediately, and none of the mistakes that have been found affect in any way the conclusions of his work. So Graham Edgar, again, UTAS, University of Tasmania, very quiet guy. He just goes about his work, rigorous work, scientific work, and publishes it. Now, when it's not what the industry want to hear, they make a fuss. Okay, so that is all I wanted to say. If you want further background information, go to my website, onlyoneplanet.com. It's in the introduction, the written introduction to this video. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you at the next video.